get into these messes?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Futurism Forever, episode 11. Tonight we're going to be critiquing Archeofuturism by Guillaume Faye, or Faye. So yeah, it's a little different than what we normally do. We usually focus on Italian futurism, but we're going to focus on the French New Right this week. On the panel, I have Alcaz, Lane for the first time, CSD, and the other Carl should be here in a bit. So yeah, we're going to be reading part 4 of chapter 2, where he really defines what Archeofuturism is. So I'll start the reading. Probably only after catastrophe will have destroyed modernity with its global myth and ideology will an alternate view of the world assert itself by virtue of necessity. No one will have the foresight or courage to implement it before chaos breaks loose. It is up to us, therefore, who are living in the interregnum, to use Giorgio Locke's expression, to develop the idea of the world for the post-catastrophic age. It may be centered on Archeofuturism, but this concept must be filled with meaning. 1. The essence of archaism. It is necessary to give the word archaic its true meaning, which is a positive one, as suggested by the Greek noun arche, meaning both foundation and beginning. In other words, founding impulse. The word also means what creates and is unchangeable and refers to the central notion of order. Archaic does not mean backward looking, for it is the historical past that has engendered the egalitarian philosophy of modernity that is now falling into ruin, and hence any form of historical regression would be absurd. Modernity already belongs to a past that is over. Is archaism a form of traditionalism? Yes and no. Traditionalism entails the transmission of values and is rightly opposed to those doctrines that wish to make a clean sweep of things. It all depends on what traditions are handed down. Universalist and egalitarian traditions are not acceptable, nor are those that are diseased, demobilizing, and fit only for museums. Should we not draw a distinction when it comes to traditions, values transmitted between positive and harmful ones? Our currents of thought has always been torn and weakened by an artificial distinction, contrasting traditionalists with those who look towards the future. Archeofuturism can reconcile these two families to a dialectic overcoming. The challenges that shake the world and threaten the downfall of egalitarian modernity are already of an archaic sort. The religious challenge of Islam, the geopolitical and thalassocratic battles over scarce agricultural fishing and energy resources, the conflict between North and South and colonizing immigration into the Northern Hemisphere, the pollution of the planet, and the physical clash between the ideology of development and reality. All these challenges lead us back to age-old problems. The almost theological political discussions of the 19th and 20th centuries, which were like debates concerning the gender of angels, are being cast into oblivion. The return to archaic and hence fundamental questions baffles modern intellectuals who expound on homosexuals, rights to get married, and other such inanities. The attraction towards the insignificant and the memorializing of the past is a characteristic of dying modernity. Modernity is backwards looking, whereas archaism is futurist. On the other hand, as foretold by philosopher Raymond Royer, someone hated by leftist intellectuals, in his seminal works Les Nuisances idéologiques and Les 100 prochains siècles, when the historical period of the 19th and 20th centuries will have come to a close, and its egalitarian hallucinations will have been sunk by catastrophe, humanity will revert to its archaic values, which are purely biological and human, i.e. anthropological. The separation of gender roles, the transmission of ethnic and folk traditions, spirituality and priestly organization, visible and structuring social hierarchies, the worship of ancestors, rites and tests of initiation, the re-establishment of organic communities from the family to the folk, the de-individualization of marriage. Unions must be the concern of the whole community and not merely of the married couple. An end of the confusion between eroticism and conjugality, the prestige of the warrior caste, inequality among social statuses, not implicit inequality, which is unjust and frustrating, and is what we find today in egalitarian utopias, but explicit and ideologically legitimated inequality, duties that match rights, hence a rigorous justice that gives people a sense of responsibility, a definition of peoples and of all established groups or bodies, as diachronic communities of destiny rather than as synchronic masses of individual atoms. In brief, in the vast oscillating movement of history, which Nietzsche called the eternal return of the identical, future centuries will witness a return to these archaic values one way or another. The problem for us Europeans is not having these values imposed upon us, on account of our cowardliness, by Islam, as is already happening, but rather by being capable of asserting these values ourselves, by drawing them from our historical memory. Recently, a great patron of the French press, whose name I cannot mention, and who is known for his social liberal views, shared the following disenchanted thought with me. In the long run, the values of the market economy will lose against those of Islam, for they are exclusively based on individual economic profit, and this is inhuman and transient. It is up to us to make sure that it won't be Islam that will impose an inevitable return to reality upon us. It is evident that the ideology in power today, and not for much longer, considers these above-mentioned values diabolical, just as a paranoid madman might see the psychiatrist that is curing him as the devil. Actually, these are values of justice, forever suited to human nature. These values reject the erroneous idea of individual emancipation, promoted by the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which leads to the isolation of man and social barbarism. These archaic values are just in the ancient Greek sense of the term, for they see man for what he is, a zoon politikon, social and organic animal within a communitarian city, rather than what he is not, an asexual and isolated atom possessing universal and enduring pseudo-rights. Concretely, these anti-individualist values enable the attainment of self-realization, active solidarity, and social peace, whereas the falsely emancipating individualism of egalitarian doctrines brings the law of the jungle. So that's he defines what archaism is there in that first part. What are you guys' thoughts on that portion? Anyone?
So it's just a big summary of what he views as traditionalism, individualism, the propagation of the family, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It reminds me of
the
a lot of.
move to individual rights.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that these truths that traditionalists hold are true for all times, which I do agree with, but I don't see how this is compatible with futurism, though.
It's a very perennialist perspective, like an Evolian type thing, where he views like the traditionalism, the truths of traditionalism that he likes to be fundamental truths throughout all of history. But I guess this archaeofuturism is reconciling that Evolian perennial truth with the advance of technology. That's really what it is.
There are certain characteristics of like traditional societies that he feels have been lost in modernity that need to be revived in the future. So yeah, the whole point of archaeofuturism, I guess, is to reconcile tradition with futurism. It's not futurism in the Italian sense at all. We're going to get into that in the next portion when he defines the essence of futurism. So maybe I should hold off on that, though.
It's almost futurism in the pagan sense, really, and the kind of having these eternal, or even maybe in the Christian sense, but obviously it takes a pagan angle. You have these eternal Christian or pagan values that are the natural order, but you want to like keep having them in this industrialized, advancing technological world.
Yeah, it is worth noting that like the French New Right was largely pro-paganism. There weren't a lot of
which
Christian,
he criticizes that in this book. He says
Yeah,
it was. He says it was alienating
he
to the general public.
He criticizes several elements of the French New Right, including their like staunch paganism, like Alcaz has mentioned, and their pro Third World liberation struggle.
Yeah, pro-Islam. We should talk about that. It's a good book, man. Like, even if we don't agree with it, I think it is a pretty good book just for the critiques it has of the French New Right and his other thoughts.
When it comes to critiques, I kind of have like I kind of agree with some of them and I disagree with others.
Do you want to elaborate on that, or?
Well, I agree. Like for instance, what we just went over, I agree that like I thought that like the French New Right was too pagan, but I disagree with him on not trying to have ties with the Third World and trying to help them out against liberalism as well.
I would agree with him on the third worldism. I'm mostly focused on the local. I don't do the one struggle stuff, like all the one struggle types would I think, they like to reach out to third worldism and try and build alliances. I don't really do that personally. My main focus
the third world does not have our best interests at hand. Like, they don't give a shit about us. We shouldn't be hostile to them, but we should not be aiding them or giving our support to them when they don't give their support to us. It should be a reciprocal thing.
Yeah, I agree. Should we continue reading, or does anyone have any more thoughts on archaism?
Not at the moment.
I guess it has certain good ideas like anti-individualism, but I wouldn't put them in contradiction.
Well, just to push back a little, or just to point out something that Faye or Five or however you say his last name does support Israel, and I think that's also dead wrong. I can agree with y'all like with minding our own business when it comes to the third world, but I do have to be critical on Faye or Five on that point.
On the Israel question?
That's not a good point at all. With defending Israel, yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on that one. My views are nuanced on the Israel question. I guess I may as well. I do think it's an illegitimate state, and I would like to see, I'm Canadian, I would like to see Canada withdraw support from support for Israel and kind of just let things sort themselves out. But I don't actively do one struggle with Palestinians or do free Palestine. I mean, I am kind of sympathetic, but it's not my top priority. I would like to see support withdrawn for Israel, though.
Yeah, that would be nice to just withdraw support from them. Don't give them any weapons. Don't give them money. Just let them do their own thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really our concern unless it directly impacts us.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, I'll continue reading because we have a lot to get through. Part 2, The Essence of Futurism. A constant feature of the European mindset is the rejection of what is unchangeable, a Faustian attempting character in the sense of one who both makes attempts and makes one undergo temptations, which embarks upon new forms of civilization. The European cultural background America has inherited is adventurous, and most importantly, voluntaristic. It aims to change the world through the creation of empires or technological science by means of vast plans that represent the anticipated representation of a constructed future. The future, as opposed to a historical cycle that repeats itself, is what lies at the center of the European worldview. To paraphrase Heidegger, it could be said that history is like a path that unwinds through a forest, Volksweg, or rather the course of a river along which one must always face new dangers and make new discoveries. Besides, according to this futurist view, technological and scientific inventions, just like political or geopolitical projects, regarded as challenges, are approached from an aesthetic as well as utilitarian angle. Aviation, rockets, submarines, and nuclear power have sprung from rationalized fantasies, where the scientific spirit has managed to carry out the plan conceived by the aesthetic. The European soul is marked by a longing for the future, a sign of youthfulness. To put it shortly, it is historical and imaginal. It constantly envisages future history according to a plan. In art, too, European civilization has been the only one in which forms have undergone constant renovation, and all cyclical return of past models has been banned. The spirit of artworks must remain unchanged, the archaic pole, but their form must always change, the futurist pole. The European soul is defined by ongoing creation and invention, the poiesis of the Greeks. I'm probably like mispronouncing that badly. While being always aware of the fact that in its direction and values, it must remain faithful to tradition. The essence of futurism is the planning of the future, not making a clean sweep of the past. The envisaging of civilization, in this case, European civilization, as a work in motion, to paraphrase Wagner's musical expression. Politics here are understood not merely in a narrow sense as the identification of one's enemy, Carl Schmitt, but as the identification of one's friend, who was part of the folk community, and most importantly, as the future transformation of the folk, driven by ambition, a spirit of independence, creativity, and the will to power. The dynamic force, however, and projection towards the future meets many obstacles. The first is egalitarian modernity, with its morality, which lays guilt upon force, and its historical fatalism. The second obstacle, or rather danger, in the social field is represented by a deviated form of futurism, which may lead to utopian aberrations, for the sheer taste of change for the sake of change. Thirdly, when left to itself, particularly in the realm of technological science, the futurist mentality may prove suicidal, especially because of its impact on the environment. Given the risk of deifying technology as something that can solve everything. Hence, futurism must be tempered with archaism, or to use a bold expression, we might say that archaism must cleanse futurism. The futurist mindset has also encountered a number of barriers, a limit to space-based enterprises because of their high cost, the trivializing of technological science and its loss of meaning, disenchantment towards all positive and creative values of mobilization, widespread loss of poetic and aesthetic qualities through commercialization, etc. The implication of all this is that futurism can only become a driving force if it takes a new course. The neo-archaic world that is looming near is the only one capable of freeing the futurist spirit from the impasses of modernity. So there he defines what futurism means to him. He defines it in very Nietzschean terms.
He describes the Faustian spirit and calls that futurism.
Yeah.
Plus technology.
Yeah. Well, technology would be included in a Faustian spirit, wouldn't it?
Yes. I'm just saying, like, his definition of it is technology plus Faustian spirit. Like,
yeah, from what I'm seeing so far, from what I'm reading, it doesn't really describe it in that anarchistic way that Marinetti does.
Yeah, like Marinetti, like he does say that futurism is not a stripping away of the past, but Marinetti defines it in exactly those terms. So like he doesn't even mention Marinetti in this section at all, which I kind of have a problem with. But he kind of redefines it in the way that like he wants to, rather than what futurism actually is.
Yeah, but like I can tell just from the short amount I'm reading, there's a heavy German influence on this.
Yeah.
Should be noted of the French New Right is it took a lot of influence from the German conservative revolution.
Yeah, it appears that way.
It's
He
not
talks
really
about
fascist. It's more like Ernst Jünger kind of conservative revolutionary types.
I do like Jünger for sure, but I wouldn't describe him as like futurist. Really, there's some overlap in themes.
Ideas that are being said by Faye or Five. Like, how do I say his last name? Damn it!
I say Faye, but I hear people saying Faye.
Yeah, Faye or Five.
There's a lot of interesting ideas in this text, but I just don't see it as Italian futurism or futurism in general.
No, me neither. It's just traditionalism with he wants to keep modern. Sorry, what was that?
I said, like I stated earlier, it just defines futurism as a Faustian spirit and a will to power.
Yeah, pretty much. Which, in his view, futurists or Europeans in general are like innovators and explorers, and they want to grow and evolve and conquer new territories, create new things. But
what do you think of his pan-Europeanism?
I'm not a fan of pan-Europeanism personally. Anyone who knows me knows I'm kind of an Italian chauvinist, med supremacist. So, yeah, I don't care for pan-Europeanism. That is like a big part of his worldview.
It's not going to work. I dislike like pan movements that aren't really aren't based off of anything besides an ideal. Like pan-Hispanism is not going to work. Pan-Europeanism is not going to work. Fucking, I would say I'm kind of pro pan-Germanism, but even that didn't fucking work. Pan-South Slavism doesn't work. These movements just don't work. They always fucking fail.
I can understand the appeal because, like, what a lot of pan movements have pointed out is that bigger nations will use these like smaller nations and their petty nationalism, support each other, put them against each other. So they need to unite on their common interests and form one bloc. I can understand that, but other than that, I don't really see the appeal.
They can form alliances without like sacrificing their
uniting in a single country.
Yeah, their sovereignty. I think like on a long enough timeline, these all these different European cultures will lose what makes them unique. Like their little eccentricities and quirks are not petty to me or arbitrary. Like they should be preserved. It's what makes them who they are. So, yeah, I mean, we can form alliances on this issue or that issue without sacrificing our sovereignty. Would be like my argument against pan-Europeanism, which a lot of Yachiites just take as a given. They think like the nation state is obsolete, and they view the world in geopolitical terms or whatever. I've had a lot of arguments with these types over the years, which I don't know.
What did I miss?
We may be heading in that direction.
Pan-Europeanism. And see, like my experience with pan-Europeanism is when the third worldists in the communist scene were pushing it. And I remember like the host of Ewoks and Hinge was all bitching that it was reactionary bullshit or whatever, and he thought it was nonsense. And every time he thinks something's a nonsense, he calls it Looney Tunes logic. But I don't know. I agree with whoever was saying that pan stuff doesn't fucking seem to pan out because it's really hard to get a bunch of people to unify over one struggle.
Yeah, I do think you need internal cohesion for anything to be effective. Sorry, what was that, Wayne?
I said it took Bismarck a war with France to unite pan-Germany.
Yeah.
Same thing with Yugoslavia. Like they worked for literally hundreds of years to build Yugoslavia, and it collapsed in 60 years or whatever. It didn't last very long.
Yeah, that shit didn't stay together for very long. Same with the Soviet Union. A lot of those countries completely broke off and have no desire to ever like go back to it. And then I saw an interesting comment on my channel where somebody was saying that Poland should not ever be a property of Russia, and then what Infrared said about that was complete bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, using Infrared's logic, fucking Western Poland should be a property of Germany. Like they ruled over it longer than Russia did.
You want to invade Poland, Alcaz?
Nah, that didn't work out very well for us the first time.
Yeah.
We just lost more
Okay.
territory.
Should I continue reading? The
Yes.
Archeofuturist synthesis? Okay. The Archeofuturist synthesis as a philosophical alliance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Futurism and archaism are both related to Apollonian and Dionysian principles that have always appeared to be mutually opposed, when in fact they are complementary. The futurist pole is Apollonian in its sovereign and rational plan to shape the world, and Dionysian in its aesthetic and romantic mobilization of pure energy. Archaism is telluric in its appeal to timeless forces and conformity to the arche, but it is also Apollonian, for it is founded on wisdom and the endurance of human order. It is a question for future society of no longer thinking according to the exclusive logic of or, but of according to the inclusive logic of and of simultaneously embracing ultra science and a return to traditional solutions that date back into the mists of time. Futurism is actually more vigorous than archaism. For reasons of sheer realism, a futurist plan can only be implemented by resorting to archaism. Hence the paradox of Archeofuturism, which rejects all ideas of progress as everything pertaining to the worldview of a people must rest on unchangeable bases, although forms and expressions may vary. For over the past 50,000 years, Homo sapiens has changed very little, and archaic and pre-modern models of social organization have proven valid. The fallacious idea of progress must be replaced with movement. An astonishing degree of continuity exists between archaic values and the revolutions technological science makes possible. Why? Because the egalitarian and humanitarian mindset of modern man, for instance, does not allow him to manage the explosive possibilities behind genetic engineering or the new electromagnetic weapons in the making. The incompatibility between modern egalitarian ideology and futurism emerges in the extraordinary limits placed upon the civil nuclear power industry of the West, through the influence of manipulated public opinion, or in the pseudo-ethical obstacles raised in opposition to genetic engineering, the creation of modified human beings and positive eugenics. The more archaic futurism becomes, the more radical it will be. The more futurist archaism becomes, the more radical it will be. Needless to say, Archeofuturism is based on the Nietzschean idea of Unwertung, the radical overthrowing of modern values, and on a spherical view of history. Egalitarian modernity, founded as it is on faith in progress and boundless development, has adopted a secular version of the linear, ascendant, eschatological, and soteriological redemptive view of history, which stretches back to the time of the religions of salvation, and which is also shared by socialist and liberal democratic thought. Traditional societies, particularly non-European ones, have developed a cyclical, repetitive, and hence fatalistic view of history. The Nietzschean view of history, which Locke describes as spherical, differs from both the linear and the cyclical notions of progress. So what is this view? Let us imagine a sphere, a billiard ball moving in disorderly fashion across a surface, or moved by the necessarily imperfect will of a player. After a number of spins, the same point on the surface of the ball will inevitably touch the cloth. This is the eternal return of the identical, but not of the same, for the sphere is moving, and even if that very same point is touching the cloth, its position is not the same as before. This represents the return of a comparable situation, but in a different place. The same image can be applied to the succession of the seasons and the historical outlook of Archeofuturism. The return to archaic values should not be understood as a cyclical return to the past, a past that has failed, as it has engendered the catastrophe of modernity, but rather as the re-emergence of archaic social configurations in a new context. In other terms, this means applying age-old solutions to completely new problems. It means the reappearance of a forgotten and transfigured order in a different historical context. 3 additional points of a philosophical nature are in order. The first, Archeofuturism distinguishes itself from conventional traditionalism because of its approach to technological science, which it does not demonize, for the essence of technological science is not connected to egalitarian modernity, but rather has its roots in the ethno-cultural heritage of Europe, and particularly ancient Greece. Let us remember that the French Revolution did not need any scientists, so much so that it guillotined several of them. Second point, Archeofuturism is a changing worldview. The values of the arche projected into the future are made newly relevant and transfigured. The future is not the negation of the tradition and historical memory of a folk, but rather their metamorphosis, by which they are ultimately reinforced and regenerated. To use a metaphor, what does a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine have in common with an Athenian trireme? Nothing. Nothing and everything. One represents the metamorphosis of the other, but both in different ages have served precisely the same purpose and embody the same values, including the same aesthetic values. Third point, Archeofuturism is a concept of order, a concept that upsets modern minds, which are shaped by the fallacious individualist ethics of emancipation and the rejection of discipline that has led to the swindle of contemporary art and wreaked havoc in the educational and socio-economic systems. According to the view of Plato that he conveyed in the Republic, order is not injustice. Every conception of order is revolutionary, and every revolution is a return to authentic order. So that concludes the synthesis portion, which again, he defines futurism or archaeofuturism in Nietzschean terms. He brings up like the Apollo and Dionysus being like archaeofuturism being a synthesis of the two. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
It's definitely interesting. You can kind of see it's very dialectical, and that it's kind of putting together two contrasting things. Like you have futurism and traditionalism, trying to combine them. So it's pretty Hegelian in that sense.
Yeah, I actually liked the ending a lot to that segment about order and revolution.
Yeah, I'd like to throw out there that like Guillaume Faye does not like modern art like at all. He kind of trashes it at several points in the book, which is not very futurist. Like futurism was modern art. It was very avant-garde and forward-thinking. It was not at all traditionalist or like romanticist or.
Are you sure he wasn't
like
trashing postmodern art?
What do you mean by postmodern art? Like, he doesn't like abstract art and the kind of art that futurism is.
Right. It sounds like the same kind of person that would probably say, I don't like any classical music that came after the 19th century.
Yeah, he has a section on music, and I don't know that I thought like he came off like as a boomer or something. Like he says like rap music and techno music is not real music, but rock and roll is eternal. Like that was like a boomer moment for me.
That's the same kind
Didn't
of
he
person.
also say in that segment that rap and techno would die out in like a few years, which that turned out to be not true.
Exactly.
Yeah, the opposite is true. Like, you know, rock music has like an aging audience. It's not really like appealing to young people at all. And young people are the ones who consume the most music. So it is what it is. His prediction there was definitely wrong.
Well, I was
yeah,
just
like
going to say that because technology creates new conditions, you can't really go with a traditional mold. This is why sort of the traditional family sort of fell apart for the nuclear family, and why certain parts never really adapted the nuclear family. And more traditional parts, like, for example, I would argue Mormonism only recently started to move to the nuclear family.
Yeah. Did they do like the extended family more?
Yeah, the extended family, and also a habit of having lots of kids.
Yeah.
That still
It's Italians in America used to be like that too, but I think each generation kind of loses it a little more, but which I think is too bad. It's good to have extended family.
Yeah, it is.
Everybody
I was-
living close to each other. In
Yeah, I
some
was just
cases,
gonna-
in the same house. Go ahead.
I was just gonna joke really quickly when it came to music that this type of person probably wouldn't be having Philip Glass or Steve Reich in their music collection.
No, it's like he says rock and roll is eternal, like because it's more dynamic, it has more like melodies and stuff, which I don't know what he's talking about, like hip hop and techno music. Those are like the two examples he goes after. He says they're gonna go the way of disco or whatever, but it's like disco
Even
is kind of
disco's
like
not dead. Even
no, it's
disco's
not
alive
like
to some extent.
hip hop was largely like it grew out of disco or whatever in a lot of ways. So like it did evolve. It was kind of a fad, I guess, but I mean,
Well, yeah,
1950s rock and roll sounds very different from like 60s rock and roll. Like it one influenced the other, but you know,
Yeah, 'cause
yeah, it
there's
just
like electronic artists today that are still doing disco music. So that person's dead fucking wrong on all on that.
yeah, I'm pro disco music too. So
Total boomer takes from the author.
yeah, I don't know. I kind of like clowning on that section, but any other thoughts on the synthesis? Or should I move into the concrete applications of archaeofuturism?
Sure, you
Um,
can move on.
Yeah, might as well move on.
Okay, part 4, the concrete applications of archaeofuturism. A concept for which no examples can be given is not an effective one. Marxism has partly failed because Marx and Engels, caught up in the philosophy of no and ultra-criticism, failed to provide a concrete description, however brief, of their communist society. The results, while its critique of capitalism was often a pertinent one, the communist paradigm has been implemented in an improvised manner, often under the leadership of autocrats and tyrants. Communism has collapsed because, despite being an ideology radically opposed to the bourgeois order, it remains an abstract logic of resentment that people have attempted to put into practice through hastily drawn political dogmas. Today, new paths must be paved. A. An answer to the approaching confrontation between North and South and the rise of Islam. The global return to the archaic that began in the 1980s has radically altered modern geopolitics. Islam has once more embarked on its march of conquest, which European colonization had interrupted a few centuries ago. Colonizing migrations are pouring into the Northern Hemisphere like a backlash against colonization and the demographic aging of the North. The 19th and 20th century opposition between Europe and North America, and within the Eurasian continent between Westerners, which did not always include Germans, and Slavs, is coming to an end. Today's contrast, tomorrow's confrontation, is between North and South. We are already facing archaeofuturist challenges. Yielding to the naive myth of interracial integration or ethno-pluralist communitarianism is an aberration. The mindset of Muslims and immigrants from the South, as well as that of the sons of the immigrants, who in expanding and increasingly aggressive masses are inhabiting European cities, as well as that of the leaders of the emerging Muslim and Far Eastern powers. While masked by a hypocritical Western and modern gloss, has remained archaic. It is based on the primacy of force, the legitimacy of conquest, exacerbated ethnic exclusivity, aggressive religiosity, tribalism, machismo, and a worship of leaders and hierarchic order, although it is disguised as a democratic republicanism. We are witnessing the return of wide-scale invasions under a new guise. The phenomenon is far more serious today, as the invaders have preserved a formidable home base, the countries they have left, the motherlands which are always solidly behind them and ready to defend them, and which secretly aspire to do so through force in the future. This is why I am speaking in terms of colonization rather than invasion. The modern egalitarian mindset is utterly powerless. Would it not be better then to readopt those archaic values that inspire our very real enemies and which, significant differences notwithstanding, have remained the same for all peoples, before and after the interlude of modernity. B. The answer to the decline of nation states and the challenge of European unification. In this respect, it is essential to prepare for a likely confrontation by doing away with the modern altruism of universal harmony. It is a matter of rethinking war, not in its modern form as war between nations, but as it existed in antiquity and the Middle Ages, as the clash between vast ethnic or ethno-religious blocs. It would be interesting to reconsider in the new forms in the making the kind of macro solidarity once embodied by the Roman Empire and European Christendom, and to pragmatically define the idea of Euro-Siberia as a bloc extending from Brest to the Bering Strait, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, across 14 time zones, a land where the sun never sets, and thus the largest geopolitical unit on Earth. Russian leaders are already thinking about this in uncertain terms and through the fumes of vodka, but still, they are thinking about it. It would be worth asking ourselves whether French nationalism may not be completely outdated, whether the nation state in Europe may not be as anachronistic as Mauras's monarchist movement was in the 1920s, and whether the groping and tentative construction of a federal European state, for all its short-term inconveniences, in the long run may not prove the only means, as a revised adaptation of the Roman and Germanic imperial model, of preserving the brother peoples of our great continent from oblivion. It is also worth asking ourselves whether in this context the United States still represents an enemy, as I myself once argued, which is to say, a power posing a mortal threat, rather than a foe or economic, political, and cultural rival. To raise this question is to identify the neo-archaic problems of the global solidarity of the North, which is essentially ethnic in nature, against the threat of the South. In any case, the notion of the West is disappearing and being replaced by the idea of the Northern world or the North. As in the Middle Ages or antiquity, the future requires us to envisage the Earth as structured in a vast quasi-imperial units in mutual conflict or cooperation. Is it not the case that the future belongs to a neo-federal Europe founded on autonomous regions, a contemporary version of the ancient and medieval organization of the continent? And this for the simple reason that an enlarged techno-bureaucratic Europe comprised of 20-odd uncertain and divided nations of substantially different sizes would merely be an apolitical jumble under the control of the United States and NATO, one open to immigrant colonization and uncontrolled competition from the new industrial countries. After the euro, the first return to a continental currency since the end of the ancient world, can we now envisage the United States of Europe, a vast federal power open to an alliance with Russia? C. The answer to the crisis of democracy. Peter Mandelson, the person behind Tony Blair's New Labour in Britain, and Wolfgang Schäuble, Kohl's Christian Democrat rival, held a series of meetings in March 1998 to discuss the future of democracy, which were reported in the London newspaper The Guardian. Schäuble was bewildered and did not always agree with the brilliant and leftist British political theorists. Here is a quote from Mandelson. It may be that the era of pure representative democracy is coming slowly to an end. Democracy and legitimacy need constant renewal. They need to be redefined with each generation. Representative government is being complemented by more direct forms of involvement, from the internet to referendums. This requires a different style of politics, and we are trying to respond. People have no time for a style of government that talks down to them or takes them for granted. Schäuble, struck by such populist and anti-democratic daring, makes the following comment. I think that we politicians have to take the decisions. In short, Mr. Mandelson's verdict is, representative democracy is over. Translated, that means things must be brought closer to the people. That means politicians are too cowardly to take decisions. Mandelson also argued that if Europe is to function at all, that it can only be through intergovernmental cooperation. That's the end of European integration if you don't want to lead politically and take decisions. It would be hard to imagine a more pointed attack on the modern model of Western parliamentary democracy. which was theorized by Rousseau in his Social Contract, and has now grown obsolete. Anglo-Saxon pragmatism often makes ideological openings, however ill-defined, possible, which are completely ruled out by French doctrinalism, German idealism, and Italian Byzantinism. Mr. Mandelson, a distinguished New Labour egghead, is an archaeofuturist without knowing it, for he is telling us that the modern parliamentary democracy we inherited from 18th and 19th century paradigms will be unsuited to the world of the future. Slow and weak decision-making, compromises, and the lack of an authority capable of asserting itself in emergency cases are increasingly common features, as are the dictatorship of bureaucracies and speculators, the paralysis of parliaments, the corrupt career-making of party members, the growth of mafias, etc. Modern democracy defends not the interests of the people, but those of illegitimate minorities. It distrusts the people and discredits the idea of populism by equating it with dictatorship, which is really absurd. Without any ideological or pseudo-moral prejudices, Mandelson also suggests the need to restore a daring and decisive form of political authority, yet one resting on the will of the people, particularly thanks to more direct forms of involvement from the internet to referendums. These suggested paths are all very interesting, for they seek to reform democracy by combining two archaic elements with a futurist one. The first archaic element, the sovereign decision-making powers set in motion by the direct will of the people. This brings to mind the model of auctoritas of the First Roman Republic, as symbolized by the initials SPQR, Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. A close link between popular aspirations and established authority, which imposes its decrees without being censored by any judges, or law above the will of the people. It would also be possible to refer to the model of 4th or 5th century BC Athens, or the structure of Germanic tribes. Second, archaic element, the reconciliation of political institutions with the general population. The modern nation state, as originally conceptualized by Hobbes, has distanced the people from its sovereignty through the illusion of a better representation of popular will. Labour MP Mandelson is implicitly suggesting a return to Athenian, Roman, and medieval principles, through a closer link between the people and its leaders. On the other hand, the term demos, democracy, power of the demoi, literally means neighborhood or rural district. In this respect, it would be possible to imagine a decentralized Europe where local peoples establish their own laws, according to the imperial Roman or medieval Germanic model. Third element, a futurist one. The possibility of directly voting at referendums by email or using individual encrypted codes. Fearing the common masses, the political and media establishment rejects this solution, afraid that its maneuvers may be exposed. Here too, as in the field of biology, the dominating ideology of modernity is fighting and censoring in order to limit the possibilities offered by technological science. Modernity is reactionary. But what is a people and what will it be in the future? Is a people laos, the mass dear to Marxists and liberals, i.e. the present population based on the law of territory, or is it ethnos, a folk community founded on the law of blood, culture, and memory? Modernity tends to define a people as laos, a rootless mass of individuals coming from all different places, but the future was inexorably looming. Near is reawakening ethnic loyalty and tribalism, both on a local and global scale. Tomorrow, a people will return to be what it always has been, prior to the short interlude of modernity. Ethnos, a community both cultural and biological. I insist on the importance of biological kinship to define peoples, and particularly the family of European peoples, as well as all others. Not only because humanity, contrary to what the melting pot myths suggest, is increasingly defining itself through ethno-biological blocks, but also because the inherited characteristics of the people shape its culture and outlook. I'm going to stop there and we can discuss some of that. Kind of read a big chunk there. So First, in part A, he talks about an answer to the approaching confrontation between North and South and the rise of Islam. Do you guys have any comments on that section?
Something that should be noted about the rise of Islam is if you compare Islam even 60 years ago, it's not as traditional as it is now, showing a gradual decline in tradition. Like if we look at, for example, the practice of polygamy, a lot of Islamic countries, it's starting to become more of a status symbol.
I'd also point out that a lot of the Islamic refugees to Europe are coming there because the governments are allowing them to, and those countries are usually the ones who are funding rebel groups in those regions or bombing them outright.
Yeah, that's also true.
Yeah.
So it isn't like an Islamic invasion, but rather than being almost first to move here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had a fun.
I kind of get annoyed about with Faye is that he acts like we're being invaded by Muslims when reality is you're just being exploited for cheap labor.
Right.
Mhm.
And a
That's
lot
a
of those
good
people
I
point.
agree
wouldn't
with
be
that.
leaving yeah, a lot of those people wouldn't be leaving their countries if their countries weren't getting fucked over. And that was funny because over in Sweden, there was a group of Antifa that were greeting a bunch of Syrian refugees, and then they started. One of them pulled out a knife and started stabbing all the Europeans.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we welcome you with open arms, and it's like, okay, I stab you then. It's kind of
Yeah.
funny.
Well,
when shit
Diego
like that
Pizarro
happens.
had a speech that he's summed it up greatly. We pretend that they are coming to us out of a desire for what we have, but really that we're drawing them into us to exploit them further.
Exactly. Yeah, and then they'll stick to their tradition for a generation or two, but then they'll start, wearing all the clothes that everyone does, listening to the music everyone else does, and then you'll start seeing their men truing out. So
Yeah,
it doesn't
like
stick
compare
around for that long.
Or they lack,
how
or they
westernized
can't handle,
Muslims view homosexuality to actual Muslims in the Middle East. It's totally
or
different.
or you see how like the minority of them that can't handle that like liberalism and modernity, then they just go ape shit and kill a bunch of people.
Hmm.
Or they
Yep.
get drawn into like radical Islam like ISIS or Al Qaeda. That's also, funnily enough, backed by the United States government.
Hmm.
I think it's worth mentioning that the reason these people are coming here is because their countries get destabilized by American imperialism, invade the world and then invite the world. So
And then
you
on
know,
Muslims specifically, even though it's the US bringing them a lot of into Europe, if the US was closer to them, they would be coming to the US. But
yeah,
the
for
fact is
sure.
they're not. So US is kind of saved from the damage they do to Europe by their imperialism in the Middle East.
Yeah, I would say like European nationalists should definitely be anti-American and take an anti-American stance. They would do well with a lot less American influence over their countries and cleaning up the mess of their geopolitics, in my opinion.
What did you all think of his critique of Marxism?
He gets into that in
I thought
like
you read.
what's specific? What specifically?
Basically said that Marxism was it had a lot of good criticisms, but that's the problem. It had too many criticisms and very few solutions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm a fascist, so I don't like the materialist view of history as being like class war is the main driver of history. I don't agree with that.
Well, it's a ridiculous view to view class was the main driver of history.
Yeah,
I
because
take
there was a
more.
point in time when class didn't even exist in
Yeah,
a lot
I
of
take
different societies.
I take
I
more of
kind
the
of
Pareto view personally.
I think
The
the Jose
circulation
Antonio
of
view.
elites.
Basically that the right seeks to preserve everything, even bad, and the left seeks to destroy everything, even the good. That's my personal view on it.
You need a synthesis of the two. Yeah, I personally take the Pareto view, the circulation of elites theory, that like all the revolutions throughout history have been orchestrated by elites.
Well, like, look
There-
at
there's-
America. He's talking about like democratic values near the end of what you're talking about, but America was never democratic. It was originally for the revolution was pushed by an elite class, and the lower classes didn't really care much for it. And it was over things like small rises in taxes.
Yeah, and only like around 20% of the population supported the revolution.
Yeah. So America was never really democratic. And so when you have data like what you got from Martin Gilligan's, it didn't show that America stopped being democratic. It never was democratic in the first place.
Marx was kind of correct on this, that like liberal democracy is just a dictatorship of the bourgeois.
Mm-hmm. Those are the exact people who pushed it.
Yeah, exactly. And it was the same group of people who pushed it in France as well.
Mm-hmm. And Carl Schmitt has a quote along those lines saying that the bourgeois supported liberalism because it gave power to them. Meanwhile, the aristocracy did not, because they didn't want private property. Because you have with the movement to liberalism, you have the movement from an aristocratic elite to a capitalistic elite. Think that's fair?
Yeah. So the next section, he talks about the answer to the decline of nation states and challenge of European unification, which we already kind of talked about. Does anyone have anything they want to mention on that section, or pan-Europeanism that wasn't said already?
Europeans way too diverse to unite.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see how you can do it and preserve the unique cultures that exist in Europe and that I think should be. They would just end up being like, on a long enough timeline, they just become like Euro mutts, the way like American whites are.
It wouldn't even work. Like Yugoslavia was pan-Slavism for Southern Slavs, and it didn't even work.
Yeah. And you can see all the hostility that exists there when you try and push
because of it.
together. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a bad idea personally.
If pan-Europeanism ever happened, it would just result in like massive ethnic conflict and probably a civil war.
Yeah. Yeah, we already talked about part C there. So any final thoughts on those three parts I just read before I continue? If not, I'll continue reading. So part D, the answer to social disintegration. That collapse is looming close can be seen from the failure of educational systems, which are no longer able to curb illiteracy and crime in schools, for they are dominated by the illusion of non-authoritarian methods of teaching. This can be seen in the spread of urban crime, which is caused not only by unrestrained immigration, but also by the unrealistic dogmas of deterring crime through education, and by the obliteration of the ancient principle of repression. Something far from tyrannical when it is based on law. It can also be seen from the demographic collapse caused both by antinatalist governmental policies and by the ethnic masochism of the ruling ideology, as well as by the exacerbated hedonistic individualism that is triggering a boom in anti-natural practices, divorces made automatic, and which will soon be mere administrative formalities. The ridiculing and obstinate rejection, both fiscal and social, of the housewife model, the spread of short-lived and sterile forms of common law marriages, the glorification of homosexuality, and soon of legal gay marriages that will enable those in such unions to be able to adopt children, etc. The demographic fall caused by antinatalism will lead to economic disaster in Europe by 2010 because of the growing deficit in social budgets caused by the aging of the population. Everywhere modernity, which appears to be triumphing, is actually already languishing and failing in its attempt at social regulation. For as Arnold Gellin grasped, it is based on a dreamlike view of human nature and fallacious anthropology. It is likely that the post-catastrophic world will have to reorganize social fabrics according to archaic principles, which is to say human ones. What are these principles? The power of family units, which are invested with authority and have responsibilities towards their offspring, the legal primacy of the principle of punishment over prevention, the subordination of rights to duties, the framing, not recruitment, of individuals within communitarian structures, the power of social hierarchy, newly made visible through solemn social rites, aesthetic magical function, the rehabilitation of the aristocratic principle, which is to say of the rewards given to the best and most worthy, for courage, service, and skill, and the awareness that a surplus of rights corresponds to a surplus of duties, and that aristocracies should never degenerate into plutocracies, and be wary of becoming hereditary. Is it then a matter of abolishing freedom? Paradoxically, it is emancipating modernity that has destroyed concrete freedoms by proclaiming an abstract freedom. While in Europe it is nearly impossible to expel illegal immigrants, the mafias are branching out, criminal gangs enjoy ever greater impunity, and citizens who respect the social pact are increasingly being recorded in police records, monitored, and having their finances checked, sanctioned, and bled by tax authorities. Faced with this failure, would it not be better to restore concrete medieval or ancient institutions such as franchises, local communitarian pacts, and forms of organic solidarity among neighbors? These, then, are the general principles. They will probably serve as the foundation for the future societies that will emerge from the rubble of modernity. It is up to the new ideologues of our currents of thought to define these principles and concretely implement them. A few concrete questions should already be raised. In a random order, why keep schooling compulsory until the age of 16 rather than limit ourselves simply to primary school, where through discipline basic subjects could effectively be taught? Kids over 13 would then be free to choose whether they wish to start working as apprentices or continue their studies. In such a way, we would overcome the impasse of the current system, which leads to failure, uncivil behavior, ignorance, semi-literacy, and unemployment. A well-organized and rigorous primary school system would undoubtedly produce young people of a higher level than the often quasi-illiterate individuals who are now making it through the collapsing high school system. All discipline brings freedom. Why should a two-tier educational system based on severe selection and the assignment of grants, which would prevent plutocracy and the dictatorship of money, be wrong if it leads to the turnover of elites and to meritocracy? The new societies of the future will finally abolish the aberrant egalitarian mechanisms we have now, whereby everyone aspires to become an officer or a cadre or diplomat, even though all evidence suggests that most people do not have the skills to fulfill these roles. This model engenders widespread frustration, failure, and resentment. The societies that will be vivified by increasingly sophisticated technologies, in contrast, will ask for a return to the archaic, inegalitarian, and hierarchical norms, whereby a competent and meritocratic minority is rigorously selected to take on leading assignments. Those who will perform subordinate functions in these inegalitarian societies will not feel frustrated. Their dignity will not be called into question, for they will accept their own condition as something useful within the organic community. Finally, freed from the individualistic hubris of modernity, which implicitly and deceptively states that each person can become a scientist or priest. Another example concerns the treatment of those who commit crimes. The future will force us to rethink the modern and ineffective means of crime prevention and the reintegration of criminals into society by implementing a juridical revolution to restore the archaic methods of repression and forced re-education. Here too, we must change the way we think. To sum up, with the introduction of hyper-technologies, the social models of the future will lead us not towards greater egalitarianism, as the stupid apologists of universal communication believe will happen thanks to the internet, but rather to a return to archaic and hierarchical social models. On the other hand, it is global technological competitiveness and the economic war for the control of markets and scarce resources that are pushing us in this direction. Those who will win will be the peoples of the strongest and best selected elite blocks and the most organically integrated masses. So that concludes that section. What did you guys think about his proposal for switching up the school system, like focusing more on primary schools and letting like teenagers decide if they want to continue school or become an apprentice and learn practical skills? I think it's a good idea personally.
Yeah, I'm not against it.
Most of what I learned in high school is fucking useless. I haven't used it since. I've retained very little of it. I just don't think about that stuff anymore at all.
Yeah, it makes more sense to teach children useful skills and not waste their damn time with all this shit that they're not going to remember in 20 years.
Yeah. You have all these people finishing school and they have like no practical work skills. You know, they do have to be able to earn a living for themselves and they're unprepared for the demands of the real world, you know?
Yeah, and then the boomers get all pissed and say, "Oh, why are these millennials wanting to become socialists?"
Yeah. Yeah, the whole boomer thing. You know, when I was your age, like I already owned like a big ass house in the suburbs. What's wrong with you people? With you like millennials and Gen Zers. I don't know. The world was easier back then. It was more affordable back then. Someone with like an eighth grade
The boom was right after an economic boom, so yeah, it was easier
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts on that last section, or should I keep reading? What else does he talk about? Another example. What
To
are
be
your
honest,
thoughts
a lot of what
on?
you read just went in one ear and out the other, so
Okay, it didn't leave
I
like.
don't have much to say.
Okay, that's fair. We can keep reading. The answer, part E, the answer to the global incapacity for making decisions, the inadequacy of the UN machine, and the risk of widespread confrontations. The nation states of the UN, from the United States to the Fiji Islands, are incapable of managing the overcrowded spaceship the Earth has become. This was clearly seen at the Tokyo summit, where these states failed to reach any common agreement to avoid the environmental catastrophes looming near. As a medium-term solution, it would thus be necessary to organize the planet according to a few vast neo-imperial units capable of reaching decisions and negotiating with one another. This would mean a return to the ancient world order, which was based on such blocks, albeit under a different form. The scenario would be as follows: a Sino-Confucian bloc, a Euro-Siberian unit, an Arab-Muslim one, a North American one, a Black African one, a South American one, and finally one including the Pacific and Peninsular Asia. So that's part E. Thoughts on that? It goes back into like pan-Europeanism kindly. He sees the world in terms of power blocks rather than nations. I think we've already talked about
And
that.
it starts to reach a type of globalism and internationalism.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't really be taken too seriously by nationalists. But it's also, I don't know, the sort of parts about neo-imperial also sort of reminded me, because like I think, let's see, uh, Dante actually justified imperialism under sort of a global homo model, creating sort of a global homo where Italians sort of rule the world. Because
Yeah,
his view is that Greeks created the philosophical base for Christianity, but that was the only goal. But ultimately, Rome is destined to be the global empire under God.
yeah. I'm
That will.
obviously favorable to that. um, yeah, let's continue. We're almost done.
And then
Part
other
F.
medieval people just sort of justified imperialism as creating this sort of global Christianity.
Yeah,
So it's sort of spreading a type of ideology to create a type of globalism. In this case, it's environmentalism. In the case of
yeah,
medieval Christians, it was Christianity and spreading Christianity.
yeah. I mean, I think imperialism is just how power dynamics work. Like strong nations
I don't
don't.
necessarily agree with that. I'm just against sort of a global homogenization.
Yeah, like I like
And you're going
imperialism
to
when
end up
countries.
failing in that anyway. So
Yeah, I mean, I like imperialism when countries I like are doing it, conquering countries I don't like. Um, you know,
I'm not against
but
imperialism. I'm just against taking over the world.
yeah, I mean, I don't like globo homo. Anti-American, so I don't like American imperialism. But it has more to do with America than anything else. I mean, I do think like, yeah, strong nations dominate weaker ones. It's just how power dynamics work. Um, yeah, ideally countries that, you know, are actually going to instill decent values in their conquered peoples will emerge again at some point,
Yeah, that would be
rather
good.
than,
Spanish Empire,
yeah,
the Roman Empire, even Prussia.
yeah, for sure.
Like we were talking about Pan Germany. I'm not against maybe in a modern context, but I like the idea of Pan Germany or Pan Mediterranean. Just
yeah,
not sort of a Pan Europe. Closer people, I think it's okay, but you have to get into a lot of details there.
yeah. I would support like a pan Europe, a pan Mediterranean kind of union before like a pan European one. I just think like European peoples are too diverse for that to be cohesive at all. You're gonna have like the wealthier nations dictating to the poorer ones how things are gonna be, as is the case in like the EU right now with Germany and France really
Yeah.
being in control of the whole continent. I want Southern Europeans to be in control of their own destiny, not under the boots of the Germans or the French. It's my personal take.
I don't disagree with that.
Okay, I'll read the next portion, part F. The answer to economic and environmental chaos. As we have seen, the modern economic paradigm based on the belief in miracles will meet insurmountable physical obstacles. The utopia of development open to 10 billion people is environmentally unsustainable. The foreseeable collapse of the global economy allows us to envisage and formulate the hypothesis of a revolutionary model based on a self-centered and inegalitarian world economy, which may be imposed upon us by the historical events, but which it would be wise to foresee and plan for in advance. This hypothesis is based on three great paradigms. Here is the Archeofuturist scenario. First off, most of humanity would revert to pre-technological subsistence economy based on agriculture and the crafts, with a neo-medieval demographic structure. The African population, like that of all other poor countries, would be fully involved in this revolution. Communitarian and tribal life would reassert its rights. Social happiness would most probably be greater than it is in jungle countries like Nigeria or mega slums like Kolkata and Mexico City today. Even in industrialized countries, India, Russia, Brazil, China, Indonesia, Argentina, etc., a significant portion of the population could return to live according to this archaic socio-economic model. Secondly, a minority percentage of humanity would continue to live according to the techno-scientific economic model based on ongoing innovation by establishing a global exchange network of about 1 billion people. A considerable advantage of this would be a strong reduction in pollution. Besides, it is difficult to envisage any other solution that would ensure the salvation of the global ecosystem. For even in the near future, it will be impossible to make any wide-scale use of clean energy sources. Finally, these vast neo-archaic economic blocks would be centered upon a continental or multi-continental plan, with basically no mutual exchange between them. Only the techno-scientific portion of humanity would have access to global exchange. This two-tier world economy thus combines archaism and futurism. The techno-scientific portion of humanity would have no right to intervene in the affairs of the neo-medieval communities that form the majority of the population, nor, most importantly, would it in any way be obliged to help them. No doubt, this presents a monstrous picture to the modern and egalitarian spirit. Yet in terms of actual collective well-being, which is to say justice, a revolutionary scenario of this sort may prove rather pertinent. On the other hand, freed from the economic burden of areas to be developed and helped, the minority portion of humanity would live in a techno-scientific economic system, where innovation would take place at a far higher speed than it does now. Here too, the return to archaism can be seen to foster futurism and vice versa. This is only a sketch, an outline. It would be the job of economists to carry on this reflection. So, that's that portion. Do you see a return to neo-medieval kind of agrarianism in the cards?
I'm not a big fan of agrarianism.
No, me neither.
I prefer further industrialization. And there's even economists that I like who push for agrarianism, like Steinberg. But Steinberg also believed in the labor theory of value and some other stuff that I disagree with.
Yeah.
So,
What about you, Carl?
he
We
also
lost
pushed
Al.
for agrarianism.
Yeah. We lost Alcaz and CSD, so hopefully they'll be back. But it's just Lane and myself and Carl now. What about you, Carl? Do you see a return to agrarianism?
No, I really don't. I mean, how's that going to
The only
happen,
thing
honestly?
I see good about
Go ahead.
the only thing I see kind of good about medieval economics is the guilds, but even then, you don't want guilds to function like they did in the medieval era. Because in the medieval era, they functioned to sort of localize the town's economy and minimize all competition. That was the primary function, more than providing a sort of protection for workers or something like that. Whereas trade unions and what the fascists later put in place functioned more as a protection and to guide the economy, not sort of to create monopolies and prevent competition like they did in the medieval era.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think we should be like the futurist like worldview doesn't look back to like this model worked in the past and should be re-implemented in the future. Like,
And people like to compare fascist corporatism to guild socialism. I would argue it's totally different because it was an outgrowth and a modification to syndicalism.
yeah,
So it wasn't a return to a past sort of structure. It was creating
Yeah.
a new structure that happens to have similarities to an old structure.
yeah, but it was
And
a
even
new
then, it's
model
not
for,
functioning the same one. It wasn't functioning for the same purposes either.
yeah. I mean, fascism wanted to industrialize and modernize their countries. Like, it's what fascists do. I was reading this speech by Mussolini earlier today. Maybe I'll read that quote. I posted it on the Telegram channel, the city of, or the government of speed. Just give me a second. I'll pull it up here.
Yeah, fascism's original intent was never to return to tradition. I mean, yeah, there were some traditionalist elements that crept up, like looking back to Rome and things like that. But
Yeah,
a lot of
the
people will.
the Government of Speed by Benito Mussolini. It's the speech he did in 1923. At the end, he says, "I am pleased to see that Rome is also waking up and can offer us sights such as these works. I maintain that Rome can become an industrial center. The Romans must be the first to disdain, to live solely upon their memories. The Colosseum and the Forum are glories of the past, but we must build up to the glories of today and of tomorrow. We belong to the generation of builders who, by work and discipline, with hands and brains, desire to reach the ultimate and longed for goal, the greatness of the future nation, which will be a nation of producers and not of parasites." I liked that speech a lot. And it does have a very futurist mentality to it, not glorifying the past or looking to like medievalism for solutions
I
to
would argue
modern
glorifying
problems.
the past is sort of degenerate because you're looking back to a primitive era, which is like the
Yeah,
definition of degenerate, because you're looking back to a weaker stage.
yeah,
Degenerate should. I think that the word degenerate has sort of lost all meaning. It should just mean weak,
yeah.
weak and
People
have
just
fallen.
people just use it for like anything they don't like. This is degenerate, that's degenerate, this person's a degenerate. Like it doesn't mean anything at this point. Um,
Yeah. Now it's pretty much just sort of. I remember some leftists saying degenerate just means I hate gay people, but that's sort of all it's become.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, should I keep reading, or any final thoughts on agrarianism? We have like two more parts to get through. So we're
Okay.
almost at the end. So
Yeah, might
part
as well
G,
just filter through.
yeah, the revolution in biotechnologies. It is in the sphere of biotechnology that the need for archaeofuturism appears most evident. Modern and egalitarian ways of thinking, caught up as they are in the guilt-engendering pitfall of human rights ethics, are incapable of dealing with biotechnological progress and face moral obstacles that are actually para-religious in nature. In such a way, modernism ends up being anti-scientific. It hinders the development of genetic and transgenetic engineering. Paradoxically, only neo-archaic ways of thinking enable us to the use of the genetic technologies that are constantly being curbed today. The modern outlook runs against a substantial obstacle: anthropocentrism and the egalitarian sacralization of human life, which inherited from secularized Christianity. Let us consider the numerous ways in which the biotechnology that is already being developed could be used, now that the stage of animal experimentation is over. Technologies related to positive eugenics would make it possible not only to cure genetic diseases, but also to improve, by transgenic means, the hereditary performance of individuals, according to chosen criteria. We should also mention the now imminent application to man of a process that has already been successfully tested upon animals: the creation of interspecific hybrids, human chimeras, or parahumans, that would find countless applications. Two American researchers have already patented such practices, which have been blocked by politically correct ethical committees. Man-animal hybrids, or semi-artificial living creatures, would have countless uses, as would decerebrated human clones, which could be used as organ banks. This will put a stop to the odious traffic that particularly affects the poor people in Andean America. Let us also recall the potential human application of a technology that is already being tested on sheep in Scotland: birth without pregnancy. Through the development of embryos in an artificial amniotic environment, incubators. Clearly, those who support modern ideology consider the mere mention of such technologies as something satanic. Yet their use is becoming possible. Is it better than to brutally censure a scientific discovery or to carefully consider its social applications? What are your thoughts on that final question? I think the futurist perspective, we embrace scientific discovery and the possibilities that it provides for us.
Yeah, so he's
Well,
kind of shown himself to be unfuturist, even going against his previous principle of advancing technology with tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah,
what do you guys?
I'm-
Go ahead.
Oh,
And the other thing that I've noticed too is that he uses terms like modern and enlightenment in a very vulgar way. That sort of with the most simplistic version of them. Because they are talking about things like anti-individualism, but anti-individualism existed throughout the Enlightenment.
Yeah, for sure.
It was just individualism just happened to be the face of it.
Yeah. I'm actually gonna take a quick break. I gotta go to the washroom. I'll be right back. You guys can talk. If we have an awkward silence, I'll just edit it out.
okay.
But give me a minute.
Yeah, I'll try to keep that from happening.
Yeah,
So,
I'm
yeah,
back.
I was
I can talk now.
okay because I was just thinking back on when Dolly was first created, that sheep clone, and then people were fussing about when I was younger. People were fussing about stem cell research because they thought that the stem cells were taken from infants or whatever, and they thought it was unethical because of course it was the evangelicals bitching about that stuff. Not a, what's your guys' thoughts on that?
I think it really just comes down to what line do we draw in the sand? Like, where does our morality conflict with our idea of our ideal future?
That's a good point. I mean, where should the line really be drawn? When it comes to like genetically engineering things, uh, technology and transhumanism and all this other stuff.
What I say is, if we don't do it, then somebody else is going to. Like, if we don't start genetically engineering children, China will, and they'll outpace us in technology because of it.
Well, I just saw something recently, and this is a little bit off topic, but it has to do with China. They're talking about reducing beef consumption in the United States. So then China, as a big middle finger, is like, okay, we're gonna increase beef production and consumption as a fuck you to America.
That's just petty geopolitical shit. Like,
Yeah, it is.
I don't know. Beef production on that scale is environmentally destructive. We should probably be. It's a pretty soy take, I know, but we should probably be going down on beef production as much as we can. Because it's really environmentally destructive and also very costly.
It is, and there's other kinds of meat that are much better, but we don't really mass produce it. Like, why the fuck aren't we eating more elk or bison or whatever instead? Bison's the same damn thing.
Yeah, we have to breed a lot more bison. There ain't that many left.
People like beef. I mean, like.
Yeah, but it's super unhealthy. It's environmentally destructive. Like,
but it
really,
tastes good, dude.
Yeah,
I love beef. I'll never give it up.
Okay, man.
It tastes good, but I sure don't eat much.
In Alcaz's fascist state, you're gonna be only allowed to eat bugs. Fuck you. And it's mandatory vaccination, and you have to eat bugs all day.
Sounds like a hellish dystopia that I wouldn't want to live in, dude. I won't eat the bugs, and I won't live in the pod. I'm kind of pro-vax, so I don't take a hardline stance on it, but I think the anti-vax shit is fucking cringe.
It is.
Conspiratorial nonsense.
There's better shit to eat than bugs, man. Like mushrooms and stuff would probably be better.
Yeah.
This is like Like, I've had fake meat that's mushrooms, and it may have mushrooms, and it's pretty good. Like, I don't really know why people fixate on eating bugs so much.
Yeah, I mean, you can eat more vegetables. People probably should. I'm an omnivore. I eat everything, but I do like meat. I don't eat it like every day though, like maybe a couple times a week. I do try and keep a balanced diet. I find when I eat meat at work, like it slows me down.
Yeah, it's your energy going to processing that meat. Like it's hard for your body to process that much shit.
Yeah, for sure. Anyways, that was a bit of a tangent. Anyone have any final thoughts on like biotechnology or positive eugenics or the other things he
I'm
talked
pro
about?
positive eugenics. Like I take a very hard line. I think we should encourage people, not shame them, but encourage people to practice positive eugenics. I don't believe in like killing people who are retarded or whatever, but I think that we should practice positive eugenics to the utmost degree. Like we should allow people to abort their child whenever they want to, if there's some kind of genetic defect with it. Or even if there's not a genetic defect and they want to abort their child, I think like somebody who doesn't
I
want to
think
raise a
certain
kid
people
shouldn't
shouldn't be
have to.
allowed to reproduce, and then you practice positive genetic. That's my stance.
I'm kind of pro-life, so I'm probably in the
It's not very
minority.
futurist of you.
I just think
Yeah,
some
I know.
people shouldn't be allowed to reproduce or have kids, and then you practice positive eugenics.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want like
Yeah.
the dumbest people in society breeding the most. That obviously will
That's what you
lead
kind of
to
happen now,
problems.
especially in America. So the lowest have the
Yeah.
most kids.
Yeah,
You end
Lane,
up with-
anybody who's 30% Jew, 50% black, and the rest being white and Arab should not reproduce. That's my line.
Be nice to Lane.
I didn't really hear a lot of what he said. Oh, did
You
he call
missed
me
my
an
joke.
Arab?
No.
You said you're 30% Jewish, 50% black.
Well, that's just a joke I started. I was making
No,
fun of
I was
people
making a joke. I said anybody who's 30% Jewish and 50% black should not be allowed to reproduce. That was a joke, though.
That's a take.
No kids for use.
All right. We only have one more section left to read. Should I start it or final thoughts on biotechnology and positive eugenics? I think we kind of talked at length, went off on a bit of a tangent, but it's all good. I'm going to read the final portion. The Archeofuturist ethic. Archeofuturism would enable us to do away with the scourge of egalitarian modernism, which is hardly compatible with the century of iron that awaits us. The weak spirit of humanitarianism, a sham ethic which raises human dignity to the rank of a ridiculous dogma. This, not to mention the hypocrisy of the many well-meaning souls who yesterday forgot to denounce communist crimes, and today have nothing to say about the embargo on Iraq and Cuba by the American superpower, Indian nuclear tests, the oppression of the Palestinians, etc. This spirit serves as a means of moral disarmament, for it establishes paralyzing prescriptions, taboos that engender guilt and concretely prevent European public opinion and leaders from facing the present threats. Actually, what is promoted and implemented under the guise of moral principle is a leftist policy that aims to destroy the very European substratum of Europe. For instance, the campaign against the legal deportation of sans-papiers, which is to say illegal immigrants, led by the French intelligentsia and show business efforts to make the deportation of any immigrant impossible in the name of human rights and the pseudo-principles of charity. The underlying ideology and true strategic objective here is, according to a neo-Trotskyist plan, the flooding of Europe with the surplus population of peoples from the South. A further dilemma, the campaign against the nuclear power industry, which are leading to the dismantling of Swedish and German plants and to the complete abandonment of nuclear power by some of the European states, with the exception of France, which continues to resist. But for how much longer? Everybody knows that, controllable accidents notwithstanding, nuclear energy is the least polluting among the energies currently available. This operation, too, aims at weakening Europe. through the excuse of humanitarianism, by depriving it of the leading energy technologies, economic independence, and at the same time of any integrated form of nuclear deterrence. The stimulus behind this manipulation, of which the credulous intellectual and artistic bourgeoisie of Europe has been made a victim, is a sort of monstrous and irresponsible exaggeration of the maxim, love thy neighbor like thyself, an apology for weakness and a pathological form of emasculation and self-blame. What we are facing here is a subculture of emotionality, a cult of decline that serves to lobotomize European public opinion. Defeatism, however, is utterly foreign to archaic ways of thinking. It will be necessary to restore the archaic frame of mind if we are to survive in the future. A certain harshness, a resolute frankness, a taste for pride and honor, common sense, pragmatism, a rejection of all non-selective social organizations, an ethic capable of legitimizing, if necessary, the use of strength, and that will not back down out of dogmatic humanitarianism when faced by the challenges of technological science, an inclusion of warrior virtues, and the principle of urgency and an inevitable confrontation, a notion of justice whereby it is duties that legitimize rights rather than vice versa, the natural acceptance of an inegalitarian and pluralist organization of the world, also on an economic level, an aspiration towards collective power, and finally the communitarian ideal. These are some of the virtues of the archaic outlook. They will be essential in the world of tomorrow, which will be marked by bitter confrontations, a neo-archaic mindset, which is in no way barbaric, as it includes the pre-humanitarian and inegalitarian principle of justice, will be the only one compatible with the character of the approaching century. 1. Archeofuturism and the question of meaning. What religion? One of the few obvious things about our age, which both traditionalists and modernists agree about, is that Western civilization has despiritualized life, destroying all transcendental values. The failed attempts at establishing secular religions, the empty disenchantment created by a civilization that bases its ultimate legitimacy on the value of exchange and the cult of money, and the self-destruction of Christianity have engendered a situation that cannot endure. Malraux was right. The 21st century will witness a return to spirituality and religion. Fine, but in what form? Already, Islam is making inroads through the breach, offering to fill the spiritual void of Europe. Yet this hypothesis, which may well become reality, is dangerous. Because of its extreme dogmatism, Islam would risk destroying the creativity and inventiveness of the European soul, its Faustian free spirit. On the other hand, the Machiavellian plans of certain American strategists has led them to encourage the penetration and entrenchment of Islam in Europe in such a way as to induce paralysis. General de Gaulle's words come to mind. It is not desirable to see Colombe les deux églises turn one day into Colombe les deux mosquées. And there concludes the reading portion of Archeofuturism. What do you guys think? Do you think the 21st century will re-spiritualize Western civilization or European culture?
I don't know, man. I think in a certain extent, neoliberalism is just way too powerful, and its control of society is not going to end. It's not going to be ended by us. It really just has to end on its own. Like, has to come to its inevitable conclusion.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing about neoliberalism. It's simultaneously strong and weak. It's strong for the people in charge of it that are the puppet masters, but it weakens societies severely.
Yeah, it's a consolidation of the bourgeoisie. So it weakens everyone except for the bourgeoisie in charge and the petite bourgeois that serve it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he argues that like Islam kind of does threaten to impose its spiritual, its religion, its spirituality onto European peoples. Do you think that has any?
No, I don't think that's accurate. Just look at westernized Muslims.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that Islam is really just going to become another component of the West, just like another way that liberalism has. And liberalism will integrate anybody who comes into it.
Yeah.
Like
they'll
even
be
the fucking, even
absorbed
the
in.
Chinese, even the fucking
Yeah.
Chinese are slowly becoming liberalized. Like where I live, there's tons of Chinese I see on a daily basis, and they're literally more capitalist than the whites around here. So fuck the people who defend China. Are like China's the only hope against liberalism. The second they reach, the second that they enter our countries, they become more liberal than anybody else.
Yeah,
Well,
they will
in the
be.
podcast, you were talking about how bourgeois Chinese are, and the one Chinese foreign exchange student wore like a Supreme shirt. So
Yeah, they all
Yeah.
drive really fancy cars. They all fucking eat Starbucks and have brand merch. Like even most of the white kids I see don't do that.
Yeah, they'll be absorbed
how
into
that
liberalism
Chinese
too.
kid also started changing what he wore, and it became more like other people around him as he stayed here longer.
Yeah, I hate the people who say China should conquer us, or China is like the last best hope against liberalism. Like China is just cares about money and global hegemony. They don't have any greater moral goals of fighting liberalism.
Yeah, and I don't understand why communists try to stand behind it for anti-imperialism when China's doesn't even give a fucking shit about spreading communism. They just care about covering their own ass and making their own profit at the end of the day.
And the Soviet Union was also very imperialistic. So was like Maoist China. So I don't really get the anti-imperialism take that so many leftists have now.
Well, because they'll come and say, but it wasn't imperialism. They were spreading socialism and freeing these countries.
That
Well,
is imperialism. Go back to what I
It's-
said about Christianity
Yeah.
being a justification for imperialism, and Faye is using environmentalism as a justification for imperialism.
yeah, like I don't
So,
care how often
You're
they can
just using
redefine words.
socialism as a justification for imperialism.
Environmentalism
Yeah,
is a better justification though than socialism.
Yeah, they can redefine words to mean whatever the fuck they want to, but it doesn't change the fact that that reality speaks for itself, and that's why I just don't really take those people seriously anymore because they're just twisting whatever. They're just twisting reality around to suit their needs, and it doesn't fucking fit what they're describing because facts prove otherwise.
Yeah,
Not to
for
sound
sure.
like not to sound too much like an empiricist here, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Anyway, on the religious question, yeah, Christianity is probably dying. I don't see pagan revival really taking hold on a mass scale. I think Islam will be absorbed into liberalism and they'll become less religious over time and more
They will.
westernized.
Yeah, people say it's the fastest growing religion, and it's like, yeah, we'll give it a few decades, and they'll start losing that too, and then they'll all just be doing like the same shit that everyone else is doing.
Well,
Yeah,
they're already doing the same stuff that everyone else is doing. Like the
Yeah.
most popular example is look at westernized Muslims' stance on gays, and then go over to the Middle East where they're still throwing them off roofs.
So would you guys argue that we live in like a post-religious age? Like, have we lost the need for spirituality or that feeling of transcendence, something more than the material? Or
Well, I don't
No.
believe in any particular religion, but I do believe in the sort of spirituality. So,
One says, fucking the West Coast, man.
and I believe in a God that organizes and controls the world. So,
yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. Like, I consider myself like culturally Catholic. That's how I was raised, but I'm not really practicing. I'm very critical of what the church actually is. I don't think in the 21st century, I don't think I'll ever be practicing again. Not hostile to Christians, but I think it's objectively dying. I'm not going to be a
Yeah.
pagan ever, so.
A lot of these churches have liberalized. I mean, they're losing their soul. So
Well, I was raised Mormon, and the Mormon Church actually supports BLM.
Yeah.
I guess we're not paused on our stance on gays because we ended up breaking out with the Boy Scouts because they decided to let gay men into the club, into like the Boy Scouts.
Yeah, I heard about
So the
that.
Mormon Church ended up breaking up with the Boy Scouts because of that. We're not terribly paused on our stance on gays, but about everything else is just terrible as far as Mormonism goes.
Yeah. I don't know much about Mormonism, to be honest.
Well, I live in Utah and I was raised Mormon, so.
Yeah.
Well, kind of raised Mormon. I went to church every Sunday, but neither of my parents were Mormon.
Yeah. So Marinetti's new ethical religion of speed. I think that's the religion of the future, and that's what Futurism Forever would promote.
yeah, I really think Marinetti's message is a lot more relevant today than it's ever been at this point.
Yeah. That's why we named it Futurism Forever, because, like, the future's never going anywhere. It's all encompassing. Like, I think Marinetti's philosophy or ideology, whatever you want to call it, will always be relevant. I don't think it's dated at all in the 21st century. Some of the examples, like glorifying like cars and airplanes and stuff, like, that kind of stuff you can move past, but the cult of progress is never going anywhere.
Progressivism isn't going to die. Literally,
No.
it's how time works.
Yeah, exactly. It's never going to change. So, Futurism Forever.
How time works.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on Archeofuturism as a whole? Or the reading of it, at least?
What I've read, it just reminds me of a lot of stuff I used to listen to, and it just sounded like a lot of bitching, but not a lot of solutions.
Yeah.
There are parts where you offer solutions.
Just a Faustian vision. That's all it is. The Faustian vision, and it creates this very vulgar form of Christianity, modernism, and the Enlightenment, and then attacks those by attacking them at the surface level face.
Can I read a part from Archeofuturism, which I liked because I highlighted some parts I liked in the book? Because I don't think it's that bad of a book.
I think his takes on sexuality and drugs were good. I was glad he didn't take a puritanical stance on those things.
Yeah, you should talk about that, Joe.
Yeah, like it is different from futurism. Like Marinetti endorsed voluntary celibacy, basically, whereas Faye says we should be embrace like Don Juanism, and it's a very like pro-sex text. He also wants legalized brothels. He has pretty cool views on like decriminalization of drugs, which I agree with. Like there are parts that I do really agree with on certain things. Like sexuality, I kind of agree with him more than Marinetti even. But yeah, it's like more positive thing I can say about it. I disagree with the neo-paganism, and I disagree with the pan-Europeanism. But his takes on sexuality are pretty decent.
I'm going to read one part from the book that I really like. Is that okay, Joe?
Yeah, go for it.
The controversy between traditionalists and modernists has grown barren. We should be neither either of those things. but rather archaeofuturists. Traditions are made to be purged, screened, and selected, for many of them breed viruses of the kind that are exploding today. As for modernity, it probably has no future. I like that part from it.
Yeah, there's a lot
I
of
think
truth
that-
in that.
Yeah, I think that's really a really good definition of archaeofuturism. You're kind of taking what you like from tradition and also, trying to push that into the future and making sure your society doesn't lose that. And I agree with that. Like, I think there is some stuff from tradition we should keep. I don't think we should, I think that like the traditional family and, a lot of other values like that.
What do you mean by the traditional family, though? Because like there have been different family models from like the nuclear family.
Okay, well, I would say the traditional family is like the extended family, but like not polygamy. I think that like polygamy and shit like that's pretty degenerative.
Yeah, I don't know. I like the extended family.
I do too. I think it's very natural, and most societies had the extended family up until the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's fair.
I think like the idea of the hero is really cool and something we should keep from tradition, like that, like heroism. Yeah, the heroic ideal.
That was definitely present in Marinetti's writings too. He endorsed everyday heroism.
Yeah.
So,
Marinetti did definitely take some stuff from tradition he liked.
Yeah, though he would never admit that.
The heroic ideal is entirely like a traditionalist idea. We had heroes in every fucking myth throughout society, throughout civilization.
Yeah, that definitely that's also kind of timeless though. I mean, people need heroes to look up to.
At the end of the day, we don't look up to machines. We look up to heroes. We look up to people.
Yeah,
machines are just a tool.
For sure. But yeah, I'm ready to wrap up. This has been like our longest episode to date.
Yeah,
so, it was a long read. Like usually the readings I do are a couple pages long. This one was almost 20 pages. So we covered a lot of ground though. I think this was pretty good. So I'm ready to wrap up. If you guys are.
Okay.
Yeah, I am.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, guys, and we'll see our listeners in 2 weeks. So, salute.